In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Malayan Emergency was precipitated by discontent over Britain's failure to recognize the significance of Chinese opposition to the Japanese occupation. After their humiliating defeat by Emperor Hirohito's legions, the British had supplied arms by submarine and parachute to officers left behind the lines to liaise with and train Chinese resistance groups. Such groups became the nucleus of the Malayan people's anti-Japanese army. Easily the most notable and memorable of these rearguard individuals was Frederick Spencer Chapman, who later recounted his experiences in The Jungle is Neutral, among the earliest books I ever read on Malaya. However, there was another side to the story. As the only indigenous organization to offer armed resistance to the invaders, the Malayan people's anti-Japanese army retained no great affection for their enemies' colonial predecessors. Indeed, their distrust of imperialists meant that the talents of British personnel working alongside them, such as Chapman, were never used to their fullest extent against the Japanese. Rather, the MPAJA treated Chapman and his colleagues as unwelcome and embarrassing guests who were to be denied any knowledge of numbers, locations, and organizational distribution. This attitude changed slightly in early 1945, when Chapman and his party managed to establish radio contact with Allied headquarters in Ceylon, organizing airdrops of arms and other supplies. But even so, by the end of hostilities, the Allies had obtained only a limited knowledge of MPAGA personnel and deployment. The leader of the men Chapman left behind when he was evacuated by submarine was Peng, who took part in London's Victory Parade at war's end, returning to Malaya an embittered man because of the dilatory attitude the British displayed towards granting independence. Unlike Aung San in Burma, Peng had never sided with the Japanese, and as a result expected better treatment for his Chinese compatriots, who had done so much to rid the country of its invaders. While he had personally been awarded an OBE, he never actually received this because it arrived in Kuala Lumpur after he had returned to the jungle to plan a renewal of hostilities, directed this time against his recent allies. The award was subsequently cancelled. The only war the West ever won against communism was declared officially ended on July the 31st, 1960. It was an occasion marked by a grand ceremonial parade down Kuala Lumpur's Jalan Raja, fronting the old Secretariat buildings. Though it had lasted 12 years, it was never even declared a war, the British administration deciding that to elevate it to that level would give it too much status and attach too much importance to what they were convinced all along would remain a containable situation. The result was a population so conditioned to it that the emergency had become a way of life. I mingled with them as they assembled on the fringes of the Padang, dutifully waving their little paper Malayan flags. With them were youngsters attaining their early teens, who had known no other existence, and who were now wondering what the shouting was all about. I shared their bemusement, unable to smother entirely a nagging suspicion that this wasn't really the end of it. Was all this just a facade to generate a fresh flood of investment into a still young nation, at last rid of conflict and ready for expansion? I had my doubts. Far to the north and well removed from the newly developed industrial estates and the bulk of urban development, the remnants of terrorism had retreated into entrenched positions just across the Thai-Malayan border. Still led by Peng, although he was rumored to be conducting the operations from a safe base in China, these were the last holdouts, the hardened veterans of numerous battles who had resisted all appeals to surrender and lay down their arms. I took my doubts to Sir Robert Thompson, about to retire as Malay's last expatriate Secretary for Defence. Within 2 years, he would be advising the American forces in Vietnam to create strategic hamlets as a step towards winning their own war against that other communist insurgency in Southeast Asia. But the new village policies that had produced such excellent results in Malaya as a means of starving the guerrillas of food and aid would prove virtually useless in that vastly different theatre of operations. Whereas Malaya was a largely contained peninsula, hemming the guerrillas into its jungle core, Vietnam was an extended strip of coastal hinterland, bulging around the subcontinent it shared with Laos and Cambodia, whose protracted borders provided a vulnerable spine along which the Viet Cong could penetrate at will via the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail. Mountainous though it was, Malaya's frontier with Thailand was much narrower and therefore easier to police. Here it was intended that joint Thai-Malayan security forces would lay down a cordon sanitaire that would keep the communist stragglers from infiltrating over the ranges from their jungle bases in southern Thailand. But here too, I thought, the lingering aftermath of the Malayan Emergency could fester on over the coming years, not through overt terrorist acts, but through the sheer obstinate will to stay alive. Having rejected Tunku Abdul Rahman's terms for surrender at the Barling peace talks on December 27th and 28th, 1955, Sinn Peng was believed to have no more than 600 followers still at large. They could prove as difficult to trace as fleas in a blanket, and as hard to remove as the proverbial shit embedded in the same material. I persuaded Sir Robert Thompson that a series of newspaper articles on this awkward little postscript might help to salve whatever doubts others might entertain that the emergency, which had continued for more than 4 years after those abortive Barling talks, was now indeed well and truly over, all bar the shouting. Allowed to observe conditions for myself, I might come up with enough material to demonstrate that Federal and Commonwealth land and air forces, under a newly created Security Council based in Kuala Lumpur, had not only gained but were effectively entrenching their winning hand. Sir Robert consented and provided me with letters of introduction that opened doors for my attachment to a number of military units operating in the border states of Perlis, Kedah, Perak and Kelantan. The Malay Mail swallowed my proposal for a series of articles on the forgotten war and allowed me a fortnight in which to research and write it. I was back in uniform again, doing what I had been denied the opportunity to do during my stint as a national serviceman, when I was condemned to serve out my 2-year term in the unappealing Woolwich barracks on the outskirts of London. Here was my chance to play soldier in the jungles of Malaya, with a rifle crooked under my arm. I allowed myself 9 days to complete an assignment which took me on patrol with B Company of the 1st Battalion Royal Malay Regiment to gun emplacements of N Battery Royal Artillery through the rapids of the upper Perak River with the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and on flights over suspected terrorist bases with pilots flying high-wing, single-engine Oster reconnaissance aircraft. Sadao in southern Thailand was hardly more than a village. Attached to it was a military cantonment whose gate bore a sign with the unlikely claim, "Through this camp pass the best damn fighting men in the world." This was a statement so at odds with the visible condition of the place and the general morale of its occupants that I stopped to photograph both the sign and the grinning guard underneath. I suspected that the Americans had got there before me. It was the sort of souvenir one could almost count on them to leave behind. Through these gates I too must pass in order to report for my rendezvous with a combined patrol of No. 8 Police Field Force and a unit of the Thai Border Patrol Force. Having recognized that guerrilla remnants posed a threat to their own security, the Thais were permitting Malayans to serve alongside their personnel, so long as they did so in the role of policemen rather than soldiers. This was no problem for the police field force, who had already acquired a distinguished record of anti-guerrilla operations in deep jungle, and who, to all intents and purposes, were just as effective as anything the regular army could produce. The same could not be said for their opposite numbers from the Thai unit, at whose entrance reposed that grandiose but perfectly meaningless signboard. When our combined patrol assembled the following morning, I felt that this particular parade would be better suited to the catwalk of a fashion show than the preliminaries of a military operation. While all the Malayans had donned their standard olive-green jungle camouflage, identical to the borrowed clothing I was wearing myself, the Thais were clad in at least 3 different styles of uniform, as though convened from entirely different branches of the armed services. I discovered to my amazement that each man chose to wear whatever he depended on for his prevailing mood. He had an entire wardrobe from which to make his selection, encompassing all colours from navy blue to desert khaki. We piled into Land Rovers to visit the nearest and most accessible of the 6 more or less permanent jungle bases from which Thai-Malayan police units carried out their joint patrols. Things had been fairly quiet since the previous August, when Operation Chai Chana resulted in 5 contacts with the enemy, leading to 2 surrenders and the detention of no less than 15 enemy camps. Arrived at the camp, I was introduced to Inspector Khalid, a platoon commander with No. 8 Police Field Force, who smoked a pipe and spoke with a perfect Sandhurst accent. I described our encounter in the forest and asked how he could determine which was friend and which was foe. He shrugged. "We can't. We just hope they're farmers out hunting for pigs. Since we're guests in this country, we're not supposed to demand their credentials. We leave that to our Thai colleagues, who never seem to find it necessary." "What's it like working with the Thais?" I asked. "Strictly off the record, bloody awful," he said. "No discipline, wear what they like, sing at the tops of their voices when they're on patrol, just in case there are any enemy around." The best damn fighting men in the world?" I queried. He grinned. "You saw the sign. Well, now you know." "Bloody sloppy way to run a war," I suggested. He jabbed his pipe at me. "Better not put that quote in my mouth." Pausing to suck again on the stem, he added, "But you're right. At this rate, it's going to drag on a long time." Inspector Khalid's prognosis was more accurate than either of us could have dreamt of foreseeing. Not until nearly 30 years later did Peng and the last of his veterans finally emerged from their protracted game of hide-and-seek. In December 1989, in the southern Thai town of Hajai, Peng signed 2 ceasefire accords with the Malaysian and Thai authorities. These attested that all 3 parties would end all armed action. Although this effectively marked the virtual surrender of the MCP, Peng obdurately insisted that the word surrender should not appear in the documents.